Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer,
And I'm Krista Carmen.
and this is
Murder Coaster.
They say when you strip away the artificial layers of personality a psychopath has created to mask themselves, there's nothing there at all, just an empty shell. Step right up, ladies and gentlemen, and hear the craziest fucking story you have ever heard. The tale of a serial killer and con artist like no other. A monster whose narcissism and arrogance led him on a 25-year crime spree of deception and brutal inhumanity beyond your wildest dreams. A story too insane to be true, yet too unbelievable to be fiction. To his wife and loving children and grandchildren, he was a loyal family man, hardworking businessman, and entrepreneur, a Sunday school teacher and scoutmaster. To the internet, he was the Slavemaster, an expert in bondage and BDSM, who was eagerly sought out for sessions of violent sex. But it was all a facade. His true nature was that of a cold-blooded killer and manipulative confidence artist. Prepare yourself for a descent into the cold, calculating, and deadly mind of John Robinson, the Slavemaster.
Let's begin. Prologue: A Christmas Miracle. Donald and Helen Robinson were a young married couple, deeply in love in 1984, and who desperately wanted to start a family, but were unable to have children. They looked into adoption, but local Catholic charity adoption fees were too much for them, Donald only making a meager salary as the manager of a Radio Shack in Chicago. But when Donald told his older brother John, a successful businessman living in Kansas City, about their difficulties, John told him he was friends with an attorney who specialized in adoptions and would talk to him.
In May of 1984, John called his brother with some exciting news. He talked to his lawyer friend and had found them a child to adopt. They just needed to secure the adoption by paying a $2,500 fee, which they promptly did. The couple was ecstatic. They'd finally have their family that they'd always dreamed of. But October came and went with no word from the lawyer.
But in late December, Donald's brother John had fantastic news. Their adoption papers had been approved, and they were all set to adopt a beautiful 4-month-old baby girl. It was a Christmas miracle.
And in early January, Donald and Helen Robinson flew to Kansas City, where they were met by Donald's brother John, who drove them to an office where they signed all the legal papers for adoption and paid an additional $3,000. When the legal work was finished, John drove them to his home, where they were met by his wife Nancy, who presented them with their new child, a gorgeous infant girl adorned in a beautiful frilly dress.
John explained that the little girl's mother, a homeless drug addict, had committed suicide in a cheap hotel room, and that the baby's name was Tiffany. The couple had their hearts set on the name Heather, so they renamed the girl Heather Tiffany Robinson.
Donald and Helen were simply overjoyed and drove through the snowy streets, still decked with Christmas lights and holiday decorations, to the airport, flying back to Chicago with their new infant daughter. They dedicated their lives to the little girl, who was a happy, healthy, vibrant child. The years passed, and the little family was the pinnacle of happiness, which had only been made possible by dear old Uncle John, to whom they felt such a deep gratitude. Their family would be joyous and grateful for 14 long years when suddenly their world would be shattered.
When little Heather Tiffany was only 14, Uncle John would be arrested by the FBI, and some terrible secrets would be revealed. Heather Tiffany's biological mother had not committed suicide in a cheap hotel room. Most likely, she'd been murdered by Uncle John, who'd then abducted the child and sold her to his brother. Uncle John, far from a successful businessman, was a con man always scheming for money, and had lied to and used his brother in a baby-selling scam. And Heather Tiffany's mother wasn't the only murder victim of Uncle John. Uncle John was a serial killer, the very first who used the internet to hunt for victims. The FBI would find 5 85-gallon barrels holding the rotten corpses of women at both Uncle John's farm as well as his storage unit. It was also revealed that paunchy, balding, middle-aged Uncle John was also well known on internet BDSM sites as the Slavemaster, an image he used to lure unsuspecting victims into his web of death and lies.
The depths of savagery, inhumanity, and the deep pit of lies that would be revealed about kindly old Uncle John, a bespectacled grandfather, would shock the entire world. And Donald would realize he didn't know his brother at all. In fact, no one did, because Uncle John was a literal monster, a sexual sadist and psychopath who would rob, kill, and lie without any thought at all and never show a speck of remorse.
So who was Uncle John, and how did he become the monster the world would know as the Slavemaster?
Well, let's get into it.
Chapter 1. Little Johnny Robinson, Eagle Scout, and Narcissist Extreme. John Edward Robinson was born on December 27, 1943, in Chicago, Illinois, the third of 5 children to Henry and Alberta. His father was a machinist and heavy drinker, his mother a homemaker. They were the typical family in the suburban neighborhood of Cicero, made up of hardworking blue-collar Catholics.
For little Johnny, crime was always an option as a career. In fact, crime was a respected occupation in Cicero, dating all the way back to the Civil War, when bribery, corrupt cops, robbery, gambling, and prostitution had all been a way of life there. And Cicero would later become the headquarters of Scarface himself, Al Capone. Infamous gangster Al Capone ran his criminal enterprise from the Hawthorne Arms Hotel on 22nd Street, just blocks from where little Johnny would later be born.
As a small child, Johnny decided he either wanted to live a life of crime or become a Catholic priest. Cicero didn't offer children much in the way of amusement, and one answer was the Boy Scouts of America, which John joined and took to with much gusto, becoming a member of Pack 259, sponsored by the Holy Name Society of Mary Queen of Heaven Catholic Church.
That's a nameful right there, huh?
Yeah, tell me about it, goodness.
And in his priestly ambitions, in 1957, Johnny was accepted into the prestigious Quigley Preparatory Seminary, a huge achievement for a working-class family at that time. And the Chicago Tribune even wrote an article about the acceptance. It was the first time John Robinson was mentioned in the newspaper, but it would be very far from the last.
And on November 3rd, 1957, Johnny would become the youngest person to ever achieve the elite status of Eagle Scout. There was a ceremony and huge celebration, and then, to honor the achievement, the Boy Scouts of America flew Johnny to London to perform on stage for none other than the Queen of England.
Beautiful Judy Garland, who'd played Dorothy in Wizard of Oz, was there, and in the dressing room, little Johnny charmed her with jokes. The event would land him another article in the Chicago Tribune. This one right on the front page with the headline, Chicago Boy Scout leads troop to sing for Queen.
Ironically enough, it was side by side with another story about the arrest of a gruesome grave robber and murderer named Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainsfield.
Johnny graduated from high school with average grades and no desire to become a priest. Instead, he decided he wanted to be a doctor. So he started at Morton Junior College, where he planned on studying to be an x ray technician and then move on to medical school. But pre med is pretty difficult with a lot of studying, and he ended up dropping out. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. Hell no. He just made some fake degrees, had them printed up saying he was a certified x ray technician, lied his ass off on the application forms, and got himself a job at a Chicago hospital. Good old do it yourself ingenuity.
And love was in the air for this young x ray technician. In 1964, he married a beautiful blonde woman named Nancy Jo Lynch. But unfortunately for the young couple, John was caught embezzling money from the hospital and was fired, and the two had to leave Chicago behind and seek their fortune elsewhere.
Chapter 2. Dr. John. John and Nancy headed to Kansas City, Kansas, where many young couples were settling down in the new spawning suburbs that were cropping up in the lush farmland.
John applied for a job as a pediatric x-ray technician at Children's Mercy Hospital, furnishing certificates and letters of recommendation, stating he was a trained radiographic technologist, nuclear medical technologist, and medical lab technologist, saying he had just been accepted to medical school and needed a night job to finance his classes, all of which, of course, were outright lies. The staff at Children's Mercy were very impressed by his credentials and hired him, thinking they'd been very lucky to find such a qualified young man, though it quickly became very apparent that he had no idea how to work an x-ray machine or deal with children.
In January of 1965, Nancy had a baby, the happy couple named John Jr. But far from the family man, John was getting a reputation for carousing the bars at night, searching for one-night stands, and had even propositioned several female workers at the hospital. He was eventually fired for ineptitude and improper conduct, but nothing stops John Robinson, and he got an even better job at the Fountain Plaza X-ray Laboratory, owned by President Harry S. Truman's personal physician, Dr. Wallace H. Graham.
John even got his own office, filling the walls with framed degrees and certificates from prestigious medical schools. And John and Nancy had another child, a daughter named Kimberly.
But again, John established a reputation for shoddy work and being a womanizer, seducing both patients and staff at the hospital, telling many his wife was terminally ill, she wasn't, and that he needed to be comforted. And then the laboratory started mysteriously losing money. An investigation into the missing funds revealed John had embezzled over $100,000 from the hospital by writing checks forged with the doctor's name, as well as telling patients to just pay him personally for his services in cash. The police were called, and John was arrested right there in the laboratory and escorted out in handcuffs. He was convicted, given a suspended sentence, and put on 3 months of probation.
Undaunted, John got a job for Mobil Oil as a system analyst and was soon caught stealing $400 in postage stamps. He was fired and arrested again, but after paying the money back, the charges were reduced to a misdemeanor. Then he got a job as an insurance salesman for the R.B. Jones Company. Here, he was caught red-handed embezzling $5,586, and again fired and arrested, receiving another 3 years of probation.
Chapter 3. Man of the Year. In 1971, Nancy gave birth to fraternal twins, Christopher and Christine, and old John started his own medical consulting company called Professional Services Association. Now CEO of his own company, he invested in some nice business suits and hired himself a secretary who would later say,
I was literally paid to keep my mouth shut.
Using forged documents and credentials, he soon was hired by the Kansas Medical Center as a business consultant. But after, quote, troubling doubts about his financial affairs, end quote, the company stopped working with him. So he started searching for investors to bankroll his new company, using a flurry of forged documents and fake letters that led to a 4-count grand jury indictment for security and mail fraud. Oops. He pleaded no contest, which allowed him to keep all the money he'd stolen, and he was fined $2,500 and had another 3 years probation tacked on.
Something was working, though, for in 1977, he bought a $125,000 house on 3 acres in the Pleasant Valley estate. And soon he was somehow president of the Homeowners Association, though the board had never voted him in, and no one really knew how he got the position. While living in this idyllic suburban paradise, John made a point of propositioning other men's wives for sexual trysts and ended up in a fistfight with an enraged husband.
Trysts are for kids. John then started a new company called Hydro Grow Incorporated that sold small hydroponic growing systems to people looking to grow tomatoes and cucumbers indoors, and began looking for new investors, which he quickly found because honestly, this could have been a great business if it hadn't all been a scam. Hydroponic gardening was just beginning to get really big at that time, and it would become a huge industry.
In order to establish more prestige for himself, he set to make himself Kansas City's Man of the Year, a title which did not exist and that he completely fabricated. But that's American pull yourself up by your bootstrap ingenuity, and he pulled it off. Even rented a hall to make a keynote speech in accepting the fake award, and invited the mayor and a state senator, who went, not knowing the whole thing was an utter sham. But when the award ceremony was reported on by the Kansas City Star, they were flooded with phone calls and letters saying there was no such thing as the Kansas City Man of the Year. The scam was soon revealed, and an article was printed in the paper headlined,
Man of the Year ploy backfires on honoree.
In 1977, John jettisoned Hydrogrow, which really could have been a huge legit company if he'd stuck with it, and pocketed all the investment money. He got himself a job as the employee relationships manager at Guy's Food, where he had an affair with his secretary, who, for some reason, fell deeply in love with the paunchy man who was beginning to bald. He also not only forged checks, but created fake employees whose paychecks would go right into his bank account, and used their Xerox machine to forge documents. But when his secretary, whom he'd told he was getting a divorce and would then marry, realized he was a liar and con artist who would never leave his faithful wife, she turned him in. He was fired and charged with felony theft, having scammed over $50,000 in a few short months.
This time he'd end up serving 6 months in prison, which he laughed at, calling it a, quote, business trip. And in prison, he befriended the warden and convinced the warden to become an investor in a tavern he wanted to open. Just what the fuck, dude? This is one silver-tongued devil.
Yeah, that's impressive. Out of prison, he started a new company called EquiPlus, which was supposedly researching techniques for the storage of bull semen, as well as a basketball game to put in sports bars. Another great idea that probably would have taken off, as you see these everywhere now, but it was, of course, a big scam to lure investors and steal their money.
He told investors he had personally financed the Sylvester Stallone movie First Blood and told them he was a big Hollywood mogul. He also pretended to be a lawyer, telling one Mildred Amati that he was handling her divorce and he charged her. And of course, he did not do a single thing but take her money, and he is not a lawyer.
He then put out ads looking for employees and hired a shy 19-year-old named Paula Godry as a sales representative. He told the pretty young girl she was to be flown to Texas and went and picked her up at her parents' house to drive her to the airport. She was never seen again. Her parents filed a missing persons report, and the police told them there was no evidence of any wrongdoing, and that was that.
Then he rented a duplex in a low rent neighborhood and opened a brothel, recruiting an experienced prostitute named Linda to run the show for him. John ran ads in various sex magazines, and soon the townhouse was filled with sex workers and was doing lucrative business.
Over the years, John had developed a taste for the BDSM lifestyle and had even risen through the ranks of the underground sex culture, becoming a master and recruiting slaves, eventually becoming the leader of the International Council of Masters. The International Council of Masters, or ICM, had started way back in 1920 London by successful businessmen who decided to start a club to carry on the tradition of the infamous Marquis de Sade, all under a strict code of silence. Meetings were held, and a committee was formed that established formal training of female slaves. By 1982, the secretive underground club had dungeons across the world. Robinson was initiated the Slavemaster, who would find women to be used, beaten, and tortured, leading them into meetings on a leash, often heavily drugged to the point of incomprehension.
Chapter 4: Uncle John. With his thriving brothel that specialized in BDSM, John decided to embark on a new career, inspired by his younger brother Donald's desire to start a family. The underground baby selling market.
John telephoned a local charity called the Birthright Organization that helps young pregnant women before and after the delivery of their babies, and told them he represented the First Presbyterian Church of Stanley, which was developing a 6-month program to help women in need directly after their birth, supplying them with a place to live and $800 a month to live on. But the woman who ran Birthright was suspicious and called the church, who had never heard of this John Robinson and had no knowledge of a program to help young pregnant women. This suspicious activity was actually reported to the police, who informed John's probation officer of what he was up to. But his probation officer said John was exemplary, a real stand-up guy, and there was nothing to worry about.
Man, undaunted, John contacted the Truman Medical Center in Kansas City and met with social workers from the hospital's obstetrics department, saying he represented a consortium of 15 successful local businessmen who wanted to give back to the community and had recently established the Kansas City Outreach Program to help girls with young babies. He impressed the social workers with a detailed knowledge of all the local Catholic charities, saying IBM and Xerox were soon to donate. One would later say,
"This guy presented himself as if he was the president of the JCs. He knew everything he needed to know. He knew names, he knew agencies. He had an answer for everything."
A few days later, the social workers contacted him, telling him they had a perfect candidate, a deserving young girl from bad circumstances who was really trying to get her life together. But when John met her, there was a problem. She was African American, which he was not shy about telling them was an issue, explaining for public relations and media he needed the mother to be white.
Evidently, the social workers didn't bat an eye at the racism. What the fuck? And went and found him just what he wanted. A young, white, beautiful 19-year-old girl named Lisa Stassi, with a 4-month-old daughter named Tiffany.
Lisa had grown up in a troubled and impoverished home. Her father had died when she was just a child, and her brother had taken his own life. At just 17, she fell in love with a sailor she met in a bar and was quickly pregnant. The two married in her 8th month of pregnancy, but he was abusive and violent, and she ended up in a shelter for abused women with her infant daughter.
John informed her that he had an apartment and fantastic job as a silk screening apprentice waiting for her in Texas. And Lisa couldn't have been happier or more excited to start her new life, a grand adventure, all due to the kindness of this generous and caring, paunchy, bespectacled man, John.
There was a blizzard when John checked Lisa and baby Tiffany into room 131 of the Roadway Inn using a fake name. They stayed there for 2 days and then checked out. Lisa Stassi was never seen again.
John, of course, sold the baby to his brother, with mounds of forged documents, making it look like a legal adoption. It would take 15 years before it was revealed who Tiffany's true parents were, and she would be reunited with her biological father.
When later asked by the social workers how Lisa and Tiffany were doing, John would say she was utterly ungrateful, that she'd stolen money from him and run off to Denver with some man she had met.
But the forged checks, fake companies, BDSM prostitution ring, and strange visit to the birthright center looking for young new mothers had gotten back to the FBI, who were quietly investigating John Robinson. And Tiffany's father was also looking for her, and it became apparent that the last person to ever see the missing teenage mother and her baby was Uncle John.
Chapter 5. The Slavemaster. Teresa Williams was an 80s girl, a pretty teenager ready to strike it out on her own, moving to Kansas City to start her life. She got a job at Kmart, but the pay was low. She could barely afford to make ends meet. She was just desperate for money and came to the point where she was ready to do just about anything to get it.
One day, she was eating lunch at McDonald's when she met a friendly, older businessman in a suit and tie. He was very meek looking, balding and paunchy, with hangdog eyes behind his glasses. There was something about him that was warm and inviting. He felt fatherly and kindly, trustworthy and safe. His name was John Robinson.
The man wasn't shy about telling her she was gorgeous, and he knew how she could make a lot of money. And she knew what he was talking about, but decided, fuck it, why not? He assured her she'd be servicing powerful and rich businessmen, some of whom would pay as much as $1,200 a night to be with her. And he did just as he promised. She was picked up in a limousine by a businessman, and the two were chauffeured around Kansas City, having sex in the back. Then John moved Teresa into an apartment and began bringing more men over for her to have sex with, slowly indoctrinating her into the ways of BDSM.
And Teresa began to see a different side to the mild-mannered older gentleman. First, she noticed that he always carried a pistol. Then she noticed a coldness to his eyes, as if he no longer faked being a sympathetic person. He became rude, and sometimes even violent. One night she awoke to find him standing over her bed, staring at her with a menacing look in his eyes. He grabbed her by the hair, and she began to scream, at which point he shoved a pistol in her face and said,
"If you don't shut up, I'll blow your brains all over the wall."
Little did Teresa Williams know, but she was a pawn in an elaborate scheme John was cooking up to frame an ex-business partner for murder. He planned on taking the girl to the Bahamas, where he'd kill her, leaving behind a fake diary saying she'd gone off with the ex-partner.
But this is where it starts to get like a movie, all Silence of the Lambs or something. The FBI had been staking John out for months, watching him and Teresa, and they suspected him of all kinds of things at this point. And they began to think, rightly so, that he was planning on killing her. So they went to the apartment while he was gone, told Teresa she was in danger, and had her pack her stuff and come with them, moving her into a safe house. The agents' names were Tom Levin and Jeffrey Dancer. But when I envision the scenario, I see Jodie Foster playing Special Agent Clarice Spaulding, coming to save the day, speaking to Teresa through clenched teeth.
"You're in danger. We need to get you someplace safe."
Old John had no idea what had happened. He thought she ran off, and he was pissed off as hell, scouring the streets of Kansas City looking for her. He even hired a private detective to search for her, and the detective found her, somehow tracked down her car and followed it back to the safe house, where FBI agents told him to get lost. Concerned, the FBI agents then flew Teresa out of state.
John, remember, was on probation during all this craziness, and his antics finally got his probation revoked, and he was ordered to serve 7 years at the Missouri Department of Corrections. But somehow he was allowed to stay free on a bond of $250,000.
And none of this bothers him at all. He's still hustling like crazy, whining and dining investors, working with an agricultural law professor and farmers on a big limited partnership scheme, pooling shady deals and ripping people off left and right. But in 1986, his luck finally caught up with him when multiple investigations in both Kansas and Missouri found him in court. And in January, he was found guilty of felony theft for ripping off a company called Back Care Systems with false invoices. And in July, he was charged with 4 more counts of fraud when he sold a property for $100,000 cash, failing to tell the buyers he was simply mortgaging the place and that it was technically owned by the bank.
The Kansas City Business Journal even wrote an article about him and his many schemes, saying,
Robinson has developed a convincing manner of gaining the confidence of business people over the years. He has the ability to ferret out information and then use it to tell the listener exactly what he wants to hear.
And through it all, Nancy was the supportive wife, always defending him, helping him plan his legal strategies. They lived their lives in the Pleasant Valley suburbs as if nothing was amiss. John teaching Sunday school and volunteering as scoutmaster for the local Boy Scouts. Their eldest son, John Jr., was now 21 and had graduated from college and was moving on with a career. Their daughter, Kimberly, was in college at Kansas State, and the twins were seniors in high school.
La-di-da. Suburban life in the 80s. John hires a new secretary, Catherine Clampett, who'd been born in Korea but adopted by an American family as an infant. She was pretty and vivacious and had a wild side, and was excited when her new boss told her part of her job would be flying around the world on business trips. John flew her here and there, sending her out with his bogus paperwork, meeting with investors for his sham companies. One day, she disappeared off the face of the planet and was never seen again. Her family filed a missing person report, but she was an adult with a known wild side, and there was nothing to suggest any foul play. She was just gone and would never be seen again.
Chapter 6, Model Prisoner. On May 16, 1987, the bogus scams and frauds all came to a head, and John Robinson surrendered himself to the Johnson County Jail to serve his minimum sentence of 5 years. Finally.
John Robinson thrived in prison. He was soon office coordinator for the jail's maintenance operation. He quickly learned computer coding and wrote new software that completely reorganized the maintenance office, saving the state over $100,000 a year, which thrilled the warden.
On July 21, 1989, John's father died, followed by his mother only a few days earlier.
Then John had a series of strokes that sent him to the hospital and partially paralyzed the right side of his face. Because of this, he was recommended for parole, a report writing, quote, during the course of his incarceration, Mr. Robinson's behavior has been remarkable. He is considered a model inmate who is cooperative and willing to participate. He has shown concrete signs of rehabilitation. He is a docile, non-violent individual who does not pose a threat to society. It is unlikely that further incarceration will be of any benefit to either Mr. Robinson or society.
Oh, good Jesus Christ
You
almighty
think they were
God.
right?
Could you imagine having been the one that penned that? On January 23rd, 1991, he was paroled by the state of Kansas, but he still had to serve time in Missouri and was sent to prison there. but he started a campaign in the Missouri prison to persuade doctors that he ought to be paroled immediately for ill health.
Now things get weird. It's this I told you, this is the craziest story you've ever heard. So the prison doctor, he had a wife named Beverly who was working there at the prison as a librarian. And John actually knew her from when he worked at Mobil Oil all those years ago. Beverly was pretty and had a degree in journalism, and John began helping her reorganize the library. The two would spend long hours in the library discussing literature, and he was somehow able to seduce her.
This guy, man, he's not good looking. He looks like a paunchy, balding douchebag, and now half his face is paralyzed. How is he able to seduce these women? I don't get it. She starts talking about his case to her husband, and sure as shit, John gets out on probation in the spring of 1993. Insane.
Chapter 7, Freedom. John is released from prison, and by now his wife Nancy, who'd stayed loyal and faithful all during his time locked up, was living in Missouri managing a mobile home park. So he moved to Missouri to be with her. And who should soon follow? Beverly. Yes, the prison doctor's wife divorces her husband, the doctor, and moves to Missouri to be closer to John, who, by the way, is married with a family.
God. John starts up his hydroponic business again and makes Beverly the president and CEO, telling her she's going to have to do a lot of foreign travel to promote the business. She tells friends and loved ones she's off to Europe on a business trip and is never seen alive again. But the checks she received from her divorce continue to be cashed.
Prison had taught John all about computers. He'd become an expert. And now that he was a free man, he dove into the world of the internet. He dubbed himself the Slavemaster, communicating with his colleagues in the International Council of Masters and using BDSM chat rooms to recruit new slaves for its meetings. He put up personal ads, slid into DMs, all while portraying himself as a wealthy businessman with a large farm and horses. Using his manipulation techniques that he'd mastered over the years, he was able to pry out the weaknesses of the women he met online and offer to fulfill their dreams financially, emotionally, and sexually.
Sheila Faith was a widow with a severely disabled daughter to care for, living on welfare. She dreamed of a wealthy man one day falling in love with her and rescuing her from her desperate straits. She began surfing dating sites on the internet, where she fell into the deceptive web of John Robinson, who wooed and seduced her. She was jelly in his hands. He told her he was a rich businessman in Kansas City and offered to let her and her daughter live with him at his estate. It was like a dream come true. Sheila's Prince Charming, her knight in shining armor, had arrived to save her.
John Robinson drove out to Colorado to pick her and her daughter up and take them to their new home. Neither Sheila nor her daughter would ever be seen alive again. But those welfare checks she got, they continued to be cashed.
By 1995, just 2 years out of prison, John Robinson now is able to put down nearly $100,000 on a 2-bedroom ranch-style house on a double lot right next door to the trailer park his wife is managing.
John starts a new company called Specialty Publications of America that put out a free magazine called Manufactured Modular Living, plagiarizing and cut and pasting from another long-established mobile home publication, and then selling ad space to local businesses.
And he's hard at work as a slave master. I honestly can't fathom how he does these things. He finds a vulnerable woman on the internet named Lois Barlow from Tennessee, who was searching for a BDSM master. He makes her sign this lengthy slave contract, saying she was now his physical property, granting him absolute control over her body, mind, and finances. Over the next 5 years, She would give him over $17,000. They never even met in real life. She just gave money to him because he demanded it and she was his slave. Eventually, the IRS taxed her for cashing out her IRA to give to him, which apparently was a wake-up call, and she officially ended their master-slave relationship. She may have lost a lot of money, but at least she walked away with her life.
Another of John's slaves was a nurse from Canada named Cindy Owens. He'd tell her to put clamps on her nipples and use sex toys so large they were painful, sending him photographs of it all. He tried to get her to brand his initials into her hip. She said she would only allow that if he did it personally when they met, which luckily for her never happened. He was a busy, busy slave master with many slaves he had to attend to.
Isabella Lewicka was a Polish girl who immigrated to America as a teenager with her parents and settled down in West Lafayette, Indiana. At just 19 years old, she was a beautiful and Rubenesque red-headed artist who loved to be sexually dominated and searched the internet looking for the perfect slave master to teach her the ways of the BDSM world. And unfortunately, she met John Robinson.
And just a note here, BDSM can be a very safe and healthy lifestyle, which millions of people around the world enjoy. But it is generally agreed on that there must be consent, safety, and sanity. John Robinson was a psychopath who practiced none of those parameters. So please be safe out there, whatever you're into. And most importantly, know who you are dealing with.
Isabella moved to Kansas City to be with her new slave master. But when John Robinson saw her, he was embarrassed. Embarrassed because she was goth, wearing all black with black lipstick and many piercings adorning her nose, lips, and ears.
This fucking piece of shit was embarrassed to be seen with a goth girl. God, what the fuck? And why? Why was this beautiful goth girl even into this creepy, dumpy, balding, paunchy man old enough to be her grandfather with half his face paralyzed? Oh, this story.
But Isabella begged John to stay, saying she'd commit fully to being his sex slave in every manner possible, do anything and everything, and he relented. She found an apartment and began working as the layout artist for his magazine. When people asked, she claimed to be his niece, which struck some as odd because they'd often be seen fondling each other. She lived there for 2.5 years with him. Then she went away for a European business trip and disappeared. When people asked what had happened to her, he'd say she was arrested for drugs and sent back to Poland. She was never seen alive again.
In 1999, a 52-year-old grandmother from Kentucky who ran her own medical business placed an ad on a bondage website saying she was a submissive in need of a master specialized in the various aspects of bondage which she practiced daily. A few days later, a John Turner emailed her saying he was interested in becoming her master. The two started a cyber sex relationship. When her brother was diagnosed with cancer, she fell into a deep depression, and it was her master who was there for her, giving her a shoulder to cry on, comforting her. She felt he was a good and kind master who understood her. She was wrong about everything, even his name. His name wasn't John Turner. It was John Robinson.
In September of 1999, John bought a 17-acre piece of land in Lassigny, Kansas, which he called his farm, putting an old trailer he'd basically stolen on the ramshackle property. He also started a correspondence with a friend from his teenage years, whom he hadn't talked to in decades, named Mary White. Mary was living in England, unhappily married to her third husband.
John told her that he'd never gotten married, but he had adopted his brother's children after they died in a car crash. Aw, his imaginary person is so sweet. He also told her he was in the CIA and often working on top secret undercover assignments. Red flag there. If someone tells you they work in the CIA undercover, they part of that job would be not telling you that they're undercover in the CIA. But Mary fell for it. All the bullshit this master manipulator babbled, took it hook, line, and sinker.
After wooing Mary, John convinced her to move to Kansas City to be with him and put her up in an apartment, but rarely went there, telling her he was busy being a top secret spy, keeping her there as one might keep a pawn in a strategic spot when playing a game of chess.
By 2000, John was struggling to keep up with all his aliases and crazy stories, even getting his many slaves mixed up. He had a psychologist from Dallas, Texas, a businesswoman from the Midwest, and a healthcare worker from Detroit named Suzette Troughton.
Chapter 5. Suzette. Suzette Troughton was a pretty Detroit girl, deeply involved in the Gorean subculture.
So, what is the Gorean subculture? Some of our listeners may be wondering. Well, it all centers around the series of science fiction books that take place on the planet Gore, known as Counter Earth, because the planet orbits around the sun directly opposite Earth's orbit, meaning Gore is a hidden planet that we cannot see.
Now, to be perfectly clear, we have not read these books, so we plead ignorance if we misrepresent the fantasy series or the subculture, but we'll do our best to explain what we've learned in our research.
In 1965, a Princeton PhD graduate named John Frederick Lang Jr., using the pen name John Norman, decided to use a blend of science fiction and fantasy to, and I quote here, quote, expand his philosophical and sociological views on modern society, taking cues from Nietzsche, Homer, and Freud, end quote. Okay, sounds heavy, right? Let's get into these books.
On this planet, which orbits the sun directly opposite of us, are insectoid priest kings, the rulers of Gore, who have abducted an array of Earth people, including Vikings, Romans, ancient Greeks, and Native Americans, among other cultures. There's a strange mix of technology the priests allow the Earthlings to have, and for transportation, they ride large, predatory birds. It's a brutal and hostile existence, kind of like the Conan the Barbarian universe, but in space with warriors riding huge flying birds.
Oh, and there's one other small thing. All the women are slaves who have been taken by force and must always obey men and have been trained to learn to like it and enjoy serving their masters with devotion and loyalty.
A quote from one of the books is, "Only in a collar can a woman be truly free."
Yup, women are kept with collars on their necks and they're called kajire. And in the Gorean subculture, they practice the same thing. The entire lifestyle, which they take very, very seriously, centers around a slave master dynamic. Women are literally sex slaves. There's a lot of leather and change and bondage restraints involved. And apparently it can get pretty brutal and in some cases violent. And there's some people who claim that the Gorean subculture goes beyond the BDSM community ethos of safe, sane, and consensual. I mean, I don't know. This shit's all beyond me. I try not to judge.
The Gorean lifestyle became known to the police in England when they heard a rumor from a neighbor about a woman being held captive, and they broke into the house to find a woman dangling in a closet in full bondage restraints with a leather hood on. And when they freed her, she was like, "Why did you do that? Leave me alone." She said it was all part of being in the Gorean lifestyle, that she was one of many sex slaves owned by her master, and they could find women bound in houses all over the neighborhood. The police labeled it a sex cult.
And it all sounds, really wild, but the truth is this Suzette Troughton, from what I can gather, was an incredibly intelligent healthcare worker. She was loved by her parents and her friends. She had two Pekingese dogs that she adored named Harry and Petta, and they went everywhere she did, often carrying them in fancy shoulder bags. She was kind. She was loved. She just liked being someone's slave. She craved it, wanted to be utterly submissive, and unfortunately ran into this piece of shit. The internet. Watch out, people. The internet will get you.
While keeping up appearances and pursuing a career in healthcare, Suzette had secretly devoted herself to the Gorian subculture, which, by the way, has its own very saucy Wikipedia page, which states, quote, formal slave training, slave positions, and commands, as well as slave attire and beautification, are practices central to the Gorian subculture. And as part of Suzette's beautification, she'd had her nipples, clitoris, and labia pierced at the exact same time.
Yowza. I heard the nipples have to be pierced at the same exact time because it hurts so fucking bad that if you do just one, you'll never go back and do the other one. But the clitoris and labia as well. I mean, fuck. I don't have those body parts, but man, I can only fucking imagine.
That does not sound like a fun time.
Hmm.
Suzette lived in Detroit with her 2 dogs and her roommate, Crystal. But Crystal was a bit more than just a roommate. She was also her sometime lover and BDSM partner. They both liked being treated as slaves by men. But Crystal and Suzette were also best friends, and in many ways, soulmates. And Crystal, well, Crystal will become the hero of this tragic story.
Suzette was big on the Silk and Steel BDSM website on the channel Port Car. And in the spring of 1999, she met a guy named JR there. He charmed her and told her how he was designing a website for the International Council of Masters and asked her if she'd like to help him design the website.
Suzette was all about it and set up a proto site called Gorian Slave Girl and used naked photographs of herself as a photo guide to the lifestyle.
Kind of disgustingly, and this is the grossest part of the whole thing for me, but hey, no kink shaming. If this is your thing, that's cool. But she was into grandfathers. She wanted to fuck granddads. She wanted to be tied up and beaten, violated by grandfathers. And that is what this guy, John Robinson, looked like, a dumpy, old, perverted grandfather. And his son had recently had a child, so he was a bona fide grandfather, which just really turned Suzette on. I mean, I don't get it, but whatever. I don't get lots of stuff. Like I said, if that's your thing, no judgment.
So this JR fellow tells Suzette he needs a nurse to take care of his sick father as they sail around the world on his yacht. If she comes with him, he'll supply her with $65,000 a year, a car, and an apartment. And her 2 dogs can come as well. Of course they can. He knew everywhere she went, the dogs went. Too good to be true, right?
Well, that's what her friends and family said, particularly Crystal. But Suzette was off. And when she landed in Kansas City International Airport, there was a limousine waiting for her. So screw all those haters. Now, this guy, what he pulls off, it's insane. Like, all right, he somehow got this big, huge mansion. I guess he rented it. He takes her there. He tells her he owns it. Who knows how he got all his hands on this place? He introduces her to his sick father, with whom they'll soon be sailing the world. Remember, his real father died years ago. So who the fuck is this old man they got in a wheelchair? They're wheeling her out. What's his story? Professional actor? I mean, I don't know. And he's got all these nurses there. And the nurses are all telling Suzette what a great boss he is. And he's even got, get this, an entire fake family. A wife who he introduces to Suzette, but the wife is, fine with this whole master slave thing. They're swingers, whatever. It's all good. It's all fake. It's insane. And then he puts her up in a fully furnished apartment and tells her soon they'll be off on the yacht.
She also instantly becomes his total sex slave, an object to be broken into submission, needing constant domination and pain. He photographed himself putting her in restraints, posting them across the internet, and bragging what a great master he was. When Suzette called her best friend Crystal and told her the kinds of things John was doing to her, including a strap-on leather sex toy with a high-voltage electrical charge they'd paid $500 for. Crystal said it wasn't safe. Crystal told her friend she was putting herself in a dangerous position. To get out. But Suzette laughed her concerns away. After all, Suzette enjoyed it immensely. But she did wonder when they were leaving and when she was going to start her high-paying job. All throughout it, Crystal kept telling her something is not right.
In the meantime, John had her working on the International Master Council's website, which was up and now had a message board where she was known as Web Slut. This is kind of funny in a weird way. Back home, Crystal's master had told her she was not to get her nipples pierced without his express permission. He wanted to be there. So, as a fun prank, Suzette and Crystal sent him a screenshot of Suzette's pierced nipples, saying that they were Crystal's and she'd gotten them pierced without his permission. Her master exploded, went into a rage, and the whole relationship fell apart. And Crystal went on to find a different master.
But as the days turned into weeks, Suzette started going crazy, being caged in the small apartment, until finally the day was here. Yeah, bye. She was heading off and would soon be completely off the grid. No means of communication as they sailed into the sunset. Farewell. They just had to stop by John's quote-unquote farm real quick. Just run by the farm, grab a couple things, then head off to the yacht. Swear it.
The last message Suzette Troughton sent to her best friend Crystal before she left for her trip was,
"It will be fun, baby. We all finally find what we want and need, and I found mine. I'm off the farm this morning for a while. Grins. Love to you, baby."
Later, Animal Control Officer Rodney McLean found two well-groomed Pekingese dogs running loose in the trailer park John's wife managed. They were split up and adopted individually. And these are seriously nice looking little dogs, like little fancy pants dogs.
Oh, why were they adopted separately? That's
I know,
so
right?
sad.
It is.
Later, Crystal received a cryptic message from an anonymous person named JT, which, what the fuck, he was using JR with Suzette. He just changes one letter in his name. The message read,
Crystal, I understand you are a slave. I am a master with 20 years experience. I am seeking a slave who is trainable. I understand that you just ended a relationship with your ex-master.
He went on to say that Suzette had given him her email and said they'd be a good fit, ending by saying,
You will be my slave, and you will understand your place is at my feet on your knees. There is no quarter given. I am firm, but fair. I am stern, yet caring. I am a master who cherishes his slave.
And Crystal sadly fell for it. Ugh. And I thought she had such good intuition that something was wrong. She started sending him nude pictures, performing lewd acts at his command, addressing him as master, and he just referred to her as slut.
He then told her, when we meet, you better get new batteries for your vibrator. I'm going to take you to the piece of the slave zone. Make your knees buckle and turn to jelly. That works. That's a pickup line that works. You can say that to a person. So much of this story just sounds like fiction, absurd. It's too crazy to be true, I tell you.
Yeah, it's I don't know, there's got to be some of that slippery slope going on. If you just can fall for one line, then they push it to I don't know. It's
He's a
crazy.
master. He's a
Yeah.
true master. Narcissistic psychopaths are able to do it so easy because they have no empathy. They don't, you know what I mean? They're just see you as an object to control. So it's not hard for them to do it. It's crazy.
Right.
And then she gets an email from Suzette saying she had met this new master who's emailing her, JT, in California, and that they'd all played together and that he really was a true master. And she was so lucky. She said he was, quote,
Educated, powerful, and extremely dominant.
and that her master was, quote,
The best fucking thing that ever happened to me in my whole life.
Basically, John is just sending this weird flood of emails to Crystal, pretending to be all these multiple people, pretending to be Suzette, and they're all talking about each other, telling all these different sides, these different stories. It's weird as hell because poor Crystal is totally catfished. She believes it, and she ends up arguing with the fake Suzette about some kind of weird master slave bullshit drama. I don't know. But finally, she started figuring out that she'd been had, that this was not Suzette she had been emailing with.
But Crystal was smart. Instead of calling out the wild scheme, she decided to play dumb and find out everything she could about this JT guy, become a detective. She told him she wanted to see what he looked like, see photos. He said, "You first, but naked," doing all kinds of weird acts, and she said, "Fuck it, sure, here you go," and sent him what he wanted. Now she had him. If he refused to send a picture, he was a liar. The ploy worked, and he sent her an actual picture of himself, but not naked, in a cowboy hat on his farm. Still, now she had a photograph of the mysterious JT.
Crystal then started reaching out to other members of the Gorian lifestyle, including her friend Trixie Gold, living up in Canada. Crystal asked Trixie if she can give this JT character her email and she can try to suss out who he really is and what he's up to. So JT and Trixie start emailing each other, and JT really likes Trixie. So much so, he gives her a bunch of phone numbers so she can call him.
Crystal also contacts Suzette's old boyfriend and former master, Bill Reagan, who was a police officer. He ran the phone numbers through the police computer for her, and they all came back belonging to the same person, one John Robinson.
And then Suzette's mother receives a phone call from John Robinson himself, saying that her daughter had quit her job and run away with some man in California. He said her daughter was a thief who robbed him and a liar and a cheat. Suzette's poor mother was so upset by the weird phone call that she called the police in Missouri, who said they were well aware of John Robinson and he was already being investigated. Crystal then contacts police in Missouri as well, who ask her to tell them everything she knows.
In April, John asked a maintenance worker at the trailer park his wife managed to get him 4 large oil barrels. He wanted to build a dock.
Through it all, John was busy with other slaves. Employees at the Extended Stay America on I-435 said he reserved the same room, number 120, nearly weekly, each time arriving alone. Then a woman would discreetly come and enter the room. The trysts were very obvious to employees, and one time, one of the women left the room and came to the lobby asking to use their Xerox machine. She attempted to copy something, but the machine jammed, and she just crumpled the copy up and said, "Forget it," tossing it in the trash. The curious hotel clerk retrieved the paper and took a look. It was a signed slave contract. Later, the FBI would come to the hotel and retrieve that paper and find traces of blood all throughout room 120.
And John had a website for his mobile magazine built, with a logo of him grinning on it. But he stiffed the web designer, never paid for the website, and it was taken down. Typical John Robinson, using people like they were toys in his childish game.
But Crystal, ever vigilant, was now sending the bizarre emails from both her and Trixie to the police in Missouri, who were seriously studying them and agreeing something was terribly wrong. In an ingenious move, they tried to track down Suzette's dogs, which they were quickly able to do. When they found them, then everyone knew something was definitely amiss.
Meanwhile, on Easter, yet another sex slave flew in for a session with the Slavemaster. This time, a very respected psychologist from Dallas, Texas, named Melissa Wright. She came to the extended stay, room 120, with a suitcase of expensive and elaborate sex toys.
John put a studded collar around the highly intelligent professional woman with numerous degrees, stripped her naked, tied her arms and legs back, called her a slut, and smacked her with a wooden paddle, all of which she loved, savoring the abuse. But then, as she lay there bound, head back as John used her mouth for sex, he pulled out a digital camera and started taking selfies.
This was not part of the deal. She ordered him to stop, said he'd broken the contract by photographing her, but he refused, smacking her, becoming more and more violent, until she told him if she didn't make a prearranged call to a friend, the friend had been instructed to call the police.
This ruse worked, and John then released her bonds and freed her. And then he took all of her sex toys, packed them up, and walked out of the door with them. He stole her fucking sex toys.
Jesus Christ. Melissa flew back to Texas, angry and rattled, firing off an email to him, demanding her sex toys back, many of which were quite expensive specialty items, and he told her he was going to send her slave contract and the photos he'd taken to the Texas licensing authorities and ruin her career as a psychologist. She got scared and called the police. Now police in yet another state are taking a look at this fellow John Robinson, the Slavemaster.
And this JT is now messaging Crystal that Suzette stole over $100,000 from him and is officially persona non grata in the International Masters Council Circle.
But he continued trying to dominate Crystal and forced his weird will on her, sending her daily messages like,
"Hello, my slut. Have you done your tit training today? Clamped nipples and all. Tonight, the ice training. You will continue until you come 3 times. I tried to call you yesterday. No answer. Sob. Beginning to think my slave is a mirage."
By now, there is a full-on John Robinson task force going on, composed of elite detectives and police from all over the country, joining forces with the FBI. And the FBI tells all of them, yeah, we've suspected him of murder and trafficking sex slaves since 1980. 20 years.
Hi, my name's Jack Luna, and I host the podcast Dark Topic, where I've been covering some of the world's darkest stories in a unique way since 2016. And I guess there's a lot I could say to woo you to come listen to my podcast, but I'll just say about Dark Topic that some people seem to like it, and maybe you will too. So search for Dark Topic wherever you listen. Thank you.
But it was all coming to an end. Interestingly enough, it was the theft of Melissa Wright's sex toys that finally gave the task force reason to obtain a search warrant. And on the morning of Friday, June 2nd, the task force moved in to arrest John Robinson. 10 police vehicles roaring into the trailer park in Missouri his wife managed, taking him away in handcuffs. And for over 6 hours, authorities searched the trailer, bringing out 3 desktop computers, 2 laptops, fax machines, and dozens of boxes before finally towing his truck away.
Going through his papers, authorities discovered he had rented a storage unit nearby. And when they went there, they found Suzette's Social Security card, birth certificate, and passport application, as well as her signed 2-page slave contract and a stun gun. They also found Isabella Luecki's college ID and driver's license, with a 6-page list of basic slave rules. There were also photos of her naked on sheets with a distinctive green diamond pattern.
Also in the locker were dozens of blank sheets of paper, signed by both Isabella and Suzette, along with envelopes addressed to members of their families.
Then it was off to Kansas as the task force headed to John Robinson's quote-unquote farm, which was really just a couple of ramshackle storage buildings and some decrepit old trailers.
On the south side of the land was an old trailer used for storage, and sitting outside it were 5 enormous metal barrels which cadaver dogs immediately picked up on, barking furiously. Inside was a dead and putrefying, naked and blindfolded woman lying face down in a fetal position. In the barrel next to her was another woman in the same position, and her blindfold was made from a torn sheet which bore a distinctive green diamond pattern, the same as the sheets in the photograph.
Police in Kansas then discovered even more storage units belonging to John Robinson. In one, there were 3 metal barrels, each double-wrapped in heavy-duty plastic sheeting with open boxes of kitty litter around them to mask the smell. It didn't work. The unit stunk of death. It won't take much for you to guess what was in those other 3 barrels.
The elderly manager of the storage unit, who actually happened to be an avid true crime fan, said Robinson had rented the unit with his sister, Beverly, to store her furniture when she moved to Australia. The authorities realized he was talking about Beverly Bonner, the prison doctor's wife, who'd gone missing 6 years earlier.
John Robinson's bond was set at $5 million, the largest ever at that time. The grisly discoveries were front-page news across the country, and John Robinson was dubbed America's first cyber-sex serial killer. The headline in the Kansas City Star read,
"Who is John E. Robinson? Eagle Scout, businessman, man of the year, habitual swindler, Slavemaster, serial killer."
God, it kind of kills me that they put Man of the Year in there, since that whole thing was a farce. But his daughter proclaimed his innocence and started a public relations campaign. She created a message board on the internet where people could come and publicly support her father. Unsurprisingly, she got nothing but trolls and hate. No one wanted to support John Robinson.
Come on, the guy had barrels of people scattered all over 2 states. Who knows how many more are out there, man? Fucking hell.
And of course, behind the scenes, investigators were putting 2 and 2 together with Lisa Stassi and her infant daughter. Remember, John Robinson was the last person she'd been seen alive with. Though no body was found, it became clear she'd fallen into John Robinson's web. The story of her baby and the adoption to John's brother all unraveled.
Tiffany was now 15 and a junior in high school. Her DNA was tested, confirming it all, and arrangements were made for her to meet her biological father, the drunken sailor who'd beaten her mother and threw her out on the street.
Her biological father said he would not seek custody and had no issues with her adoptive parents who'd been duped. He didn't blame them. In an interview about reuniting with his daughter, he said,
"It'd make a hell of a movie, but I'd need a good price. You better get it now because they're starting to roll in. I got people overseas calling me."
Seems like this tiger had not changed his stripes from when he was a piece of shit before. All of the bodies in the 5 barrels were publicly identified. They were Isabella Luecki, Suzette Troughton, Beverly Bonner, Sheila Faith, and Sheila's disabled daughter. But there were many other missing women known to have associated with Robinson. At least 11.
He was to be tried in both Kansas and Missouri. The first trial was in Kansas and had 110 witnesses, many very brave, to come forward, like Melissa Wright, who was a board-certified psychologist and risked her career by telling her harrowing story. There were 500 exhibits, including bizarre sexual devices, homemade porn videos of violent sex, plus the barrels. And in the end, it only took the jury 11 hours to find him obviously guilty on all counts. And on Halloween, the sentencing phase of John Robinson's trial began, and the jury unanimously gave him the death penalty. By that time, not a single one of John's family members was coming forward to support him.
He was then tried in Missouri, but took a plea and pled guilty, escaping the death penalty in that state, but was sent back to Kansas to rot on death row, where he remains to this day.
As for other potential victims, one investigator in the case said,
He's maintained the secrets about what he's done with the women. He won't ever tell. It's the last control he's got. There are probably other barrels waiting to be opened, other bodies waiting to be found.
but as this crazy, crazy story comes to a close, I think we should all think of Crystal. She was a true friend, as well as a detective in her own right. And without her, there is a chance this monster may have gone on killing. And we all need a Crystal in our lives, someone who doesn't judge us, but is there to tell us when we go too far, to warn us of danger, and to fight like hell for us. Thank you, Crystal. You're a true hero.
Agreed. I mean, God, there were, like in so many of these stories we cover, there were opportunities, so many opportunities along the way for like people that got close to him in positions of authority. You know, his parole officer saying that, yeah, he's a great guy, let him go. Like there was just all opportunities for things to have gone in a different direction.
I can't believe the FBI had been investigating him for over 20 years.
Right. Which
And
like
all these women are going missing, like left, right, geez, like.
which like makes you a little like makes you wonder like how many other open investigations do they have into people where they just don't have quite enough to like move on yet, but they're like very obviously persons of interest that are probably so worth having off the streets and locking up, and it's just terrifying.
I guess one of the things that happened is when he went to prison for all those years, I think he was in there like 7 years. It just threw a loop when he got out. Like all the investigations, the FBI, everything was just stalled. You know what I mean? He was like kind of gave him a fresh slate.
Jeez, crazy.
And
it really is
insane story.
Yeah, it really is, and that's what I was gonna say. Like it's like I loved the line about this being it's too crazy to be true, but too unbelievable to be fiction, because it's like we've talked about that before, when something is so wild that like you couldn't even write about it as it happened because you'd like lose your audience for being an unbelievable story. It's just crazy.
I don't understand how you can steal a baby and sell it. Like there's social security numbers, fingerprints. Like you've had baby, you know what I mean? When you go to the hospital, there's so much documentation.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it was a different time in the 80s, but there was still the 80s it wasn't like the 1800s. You know what I mean? Like
I know.
how the
It's
fuck
crazy.
was he able to pull that off? All the fake adoption papers, like
I know, and that's another. You know, it's tragic that all those women who lost their lives, but the poor little girl who was just like a pawn that, you know, was sold to. And I mean, like,
Can you imagine finding out your uncle had killed your mom and he's not even your real uncle and sold you on the black market to his brother?
No.
Oh my God, it's fucking insane.
And you know, like, I hope she has a really good relationship with her adoptive parents and like things are great there.
I think they do, yeah.
That's good to hear. But like they're like obviously not knowing their relationship and being just an outsider, like there's an element too of like your adopted father is the brother of this monster. Like that's kind of unnerving to say the least.
They had always told her she was adopted too ever since she was really little.
Jeez.
So it made it easier, you know what I mean? Like
well, I wish them the best, and Crystal as well, and I hope there aren't truly more barrels out there.
Yeah. And thank you so much for listening, everybody. We will see you next week. We got a spooky one. Ed and Lorraine Warren are coming back. Those supernatural superheroes to save the day. And you know we want to hear from you. Did we get something wrong? Do you got a case we think we should cover? You just want to say hi? Drop us a line at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. See you next week.